By late 1943, the character of the Pacific War had changed. The furious island-hopping campaigns that brought U.S. Marines and soldiers across the Central Pacific revealed an enemy that no longer relied solely on the dramatic banzai charges of earlier battles. Japan's high command, recognizing the futility of wasting lives in suicidal frontal assaults, adopted a new doctrine: fight from beneath the earth. The order came from Tokyo after the catastrophic defeats at Guadalcanal and Tarawa. Military planners concluded that only a defense in depth, anchored in fortified caves and interconnected tunnels, could slow the relentless American advance. Instead of rushing to die in daylight, Japanese infantry would force the enemy to dig them out, yard by bloody yard. The chosen battlefields of 1944 to 45, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, were landscapes shaped by coral ridges, volcanic rock, and natural caverns. These geological features offered ideal protection. Engineers expanded caves into elaborate fortresses. Entrances were camouflaged, firing ports drilled at cunning angles, and tunnels linked command posts, ammunition stores, and living quarters. Some complexes contained hospitals and kitchens, all hidden under tons of stone. When Marines later seized maps from Japanese corpses, they found networks stretching for miles, with layer upon layer of fallback positions. For American forces, these defenses represented a nightmare. A ridge that appeared lifeless under bombardment could conceal hundreds of men who would emerge as soon as the shelling stopped. Machine gun fire, mortar blasts, and snipers erupted from unseen holes. Every advance became a contest against an invisible enemy who seemed to vanish into the earth. "We thought we had killed them all," one Marine sergeant recalled on Saipan, "but they kept coming out of the rocks like ghosts." At first, the U.S. answer was infantry ingenuity. Marines and soldiers used grenades, satchel charges, and demolitions to seal cave mouths. Riflemen covered flame teams carrying the cumbersome M2 portable flamethrower, whose short range of barely 30-40 yards required suicidal bravery. These infantry flamethrowers, while effective, made their operators prime targets. "Our flame men never lasted long," a Marine lieutenant admitted. "The Japanese knew what fire could do, and they shot those tanks first." Still, the psychological power of fire was unmistakable. Japanese soldiers, who prided themselves on endurance and contempt for death, often broke when confronted with flames roaring into their positions. Postwar interrogations revealed why. In the close confines of a cave, fire was not just heat. It consumed oxygen, filled chambers with choking smoke, and turned stone hideouts into ovens. Survivors remembered comrades clawing at rock walls in blind panic. By early 1944, U.S. commanders recognized that relying solely on infantry-carried flamethrowers was unsustainable. The battles ahead promised even more elaborate cave systems, and the casualty toll from frontal assaults was rising. Army Chemical Warfare Service records show urgent memos. Request armored flame capability. Present infantry flamethrowers insufficient against deep emplacements. The idea of mounting flamethrowers on tanks was not new. Experiments dated back to the interwar years, but the Pacific campaigns provided the decisive push. If a Sherman or Stuart could carry the fuel, project the fire farther, and shield its operator with steel, then caves could be neutralized without sacrificing entire squads. The Japanese had no expectation that such machines were coming. Their doctrine assumed Americans would bleed themselves white against fortified hillsides. "We knew they would bring artillery and bombs," one Japanese officer later recalled, but fire from tanks was beyond imagination. In Tokyo's planning rooms, caves were considered impregnable to all but the most destructive aerial bombardment. No one accounted for a vehicle that could spit fire into cave mouths with terrifying precision. Thus, as 1944 opened and U.S. forces prepared to storm Saipan, a new weapon rolled toward the beaches: flamethrower tanks conceived in urgency, improvised in workshops, and destined to become the most feared answer to Japan's underground war. The first flamethrower tanks that reached the Pacific were not the polished weapons of later battles, but improvised machines, born out of necessity in workshops scattered across Hawaii, New Caledonia, and the Marianas staging areas. Their creation owed more to the ingenuity of Marine engineers and Army ordnance officers than to any centralized program. The technical challenge was clear: how to mount a flamethrower, originally designed to be man-portable, onto an armored chassis without crippling the tank's primary functions. The standard U.S. infantry flamethrower, the M2, could project a stream of fire roughly 30 to 40 yards. For tank use, that range needed to be extended threefold, with a steady supply of pressurized fuel and a mechanism durable enough to survive the recoil and vibrations of combat. Early prototypes replaced the coaxial machine gun on the M3 Stuart light tank with a flamethrower nozzle. Known as the Saipan, this field-modified vehicle carried a fuel tank inside the hull, feeding pressurized napalm to the gunner's controls. Reports from engineers noted the hazards: leaky valves, weak igniters, and the constant fear that a Japanese shell might transform the tank into a rolling inferno. Still, in tests against dummy caves on Oahu, the Saipan proved its worth. Jets of fire arced nearly 120 yards, long enough to reach in the concealed cave mouths. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance and the Army's Chemical Warfare Service soon joined forces to refine the concept. By mid-1944, larger Shermans were receiving modifications. Some designs mounted the flamethrower in place of the bow machine gun, while others integrated it into the main gun itself, disguising the nozzles so that Japanese defenders could not distinguish a flame tank from a standard Sherman until it unleashed fire. Engineers debated endlessly whether concealment or maximum fuel capacity mattered more. In practice, both mattered. Tanks that revealed themselves too soon became magnets for Japanese artillery, while those with too little fuel could not clear more than a few positions before retreating. The evolution of fuel was just as critical as the mechanics. The earliest flamethrowers used gasoline, but in the Pacific, technicians soon learned that thickened fuel, napalm, was devastating. The sticky, burning substance clung to walls, rocks, and flesh, smothering defenders even in the deepest crevices. When a tank flame projector poured napalm into a cave, the effect was more than physical destruction. It drained defenders of oxygen, filling tunnels with superheated smoke. In after-action reports from Saipan, Marine officers wrote with grim precision: targets neutralized, cave rendered untenable, survivors none. The technical breakthrough was not only technical, but psychological. Infantrymen who had struggled to approach cave mouths with handheld flamethrowers now had armored allies to do the work. A Marine private on Peleliu recalled, "When we saw a Sherman roll up with the flame gear, we cheered. That meant maybe we didn't have to crawl up there with the tank on our back." Japanese observers were caught off guard. Captured war diaries of the 4th Air Group stationed on Truk record disbelief. Enemy tanks emit fire, impossible to withstand. Soldiers report whole caves engulfed. Postwar interrogations confirmed that the sudden appearance of flame tanks shocked even hardened commanders. They had drilled their men to expect artillery barrages and bombing runs, but no manual prepared them for armored, fire-breathing machines. The improvisation continued throughout the campaigns. At Peleliu, tanks were fitted with the CB-H-1 flamethrower kit capable of projecting fire 150 yards. On Iwo Jima, engineers worked side by side with tank crews repairing flamethrower Shermans overnight so they could return to the lines by dawn. The weapon was never perfect. Mechanical failures, clogged fuel lines, and Japanese anti-tank tactics kept crews on edge, but the sheer terror it inspired outweighed every shortcoming. By late 1944, the U.S. had turned flamethrower tanks from desperate improvisation into doctrine.
Manuals circulated, training films were produced, and every Marine division preparing for invasion counted on them. Yet for all the planning, few American soldiers could imagine the scenes that lay ahead when fire met cave on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa.
On June 15, 1944, the beaches of Saipan erupted under Japanese fire. Waves of Marines struggled ashore through surf churned by artillery shells. Behind them, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions carried a weapon the Japanese had never seen in battle before: the flamethrower tank. The Saipan Stewarts of the 708th Amphibian Tank Battalion were the first to prove their worth. Their arrival had been an act of improvisation, old M3 light tanks fitted with auxiliary flame equipment. But they were now thrust into the thick of one of the Pacific War's most critical campaigns. American planners knew Saipan's capture would put B-29 bases within range of Tokyo, and they also knew the Japanese defenders had built formidable cave defenses in the island's coral ridges. By the second day, Marines advancing inland discovered the extent of those fortifications. Japanese soldiers had transformed the natural limestone into an underground labyrinth. Every ridge concealed firing apertures, every slope hid bunkers linked by tunnels. Infantry flamethrowers could silence some positions, but the cost was staggering. Marines dragging the 70-pound M2 flame units up rocky hills became easy prey for snipers and machine gun nests. The need for armored fire was immediate. On June 17th, near the Oslito airfield, a Saipan was called forward to attack a stubborn cave complex that had held up an entire battalion. Witnesses recalled the moment vividly. The small tank lumbered into range, its nozzle swiveling toward a dark hole in the coral. A jet of fire shot out with a roar, streaming nearly 120 yards into the cave mouth. A second burst followed, then a third. From inside came muffled explosions, smoke, and finally, silence. Marines advanced cautiously, only to find the cave blackened, its defenders annihilated. A platoon commander later remarked, "That little Stewart did more in 10 minutes than we could have done in half a day." Word spread quickly. Infantry units began requesting flamethrower tanks by radio whenever they encountered stubborn resistance. Their effect was not only destructive but deeply demoralizing. Prisoners taken later confessed that fire was the one weapon their men could not endure. "Bullets we could dodge, shells we could hide from," one captured Japanese sergeant said in a 1945 interrogation. "But when the fire came, we lost our spirit. The cave became death." Still, the early flame tanks were fragile. The Stewarts' light armor left them vulnerable to anti-tank guns and mines. On June 20th, a Saipan advancing against caves near Mount Tapochau was struck by a 47mm shell. It ignited its fuel system, turning the tank into a fireball. Marines who witnessed the explosion remembered the grim irony: the weapon of fire consumed by fire itself. Such losses reminded commanders that flame tanks were not invincible, and that their use demanded coordination with infantry and artillery to shield them from counterattacks. Yet the results outweighed the risks. After-action reports compiled by 13th Fighter Command and Marine officers emphasized that flamethrower tanks accelerated advances and reduced infantry casualties. General Holland Smith, commander of 5 Amphibious Corps, noted in his field report, "Armored flame units proved indispensable. Recommend further development and allocation to all assault divisions." For the Japanese defenders, Saipan was a revelation of horror. Their doctrine had assured them that cave warfare would exhaust American troops. Instead, they faced a weapon that negated their underground advantage. Diaries recovered from the bodies of officers spoke of despair. "The caves are no longer safe. The enemy sends fire into our lungs. We cannot endure this." By July 9th, when organized resistance ended, flamethrower tanks had secured their reputation. Saipan was the baptism of fire, not just for the machines themselves, but for the doctrine that would dominate future battles. As the U.S. prepared for Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, one lesson was written into every plan: Where there were caves, there must be tanks that breathed fire. When the 1st Marine Division landed on Peleliu in September 1944, expectations were grim but not extraordinary. Planners predicted the island would be secured within a week. Instead, it became one of the bloodiest struggles of the Pacific War. 74 days of combat on a tiny coral outcrop only 6 miles long. The reason was clear almost from the first step inland. Peleliu was a fortress of caves. The island's Umurburgol Mountains, jagged ridges of razor-sharp coral, had been hollowed into an underground citadel. The Japanese 14th Infantry Division, commanded by Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had studied the defeats at Saipan and adapted. Gone were the feudal banzai charges of earlier campaigns. Instead, Nakagawa's men dug deep, linking hundreds of caves and bunkers with tunnels. Each position had multiple exits, allowing defenders to survive bombardment, retreat under pressure, and reappear unexpectedly. The Marines quickly realized they were facing an enemy that would not be blasted into submission by artillery or bombing alone. Napalm strikes from carrier aircraft scorched the ridges, but within hours, defenders re-emerged, manning machine guns and mortars. Rifle fire cracked from holes invisible to advancing infantry. Every advance meant clearing cave after cave in suffocating heat. Here, flamethrower tanks came into their own. The 1st Tank Battalion had brought M4 Shermans modified with the CB-H-1 flamethrower kit. Unlike the light Stuarts of Saipan, these Shermans carried heavier armor, more fuel, and could project flame over 150 yards. Their arrival on the battlefield offered Marines a weapon uniquely suited to the coral ridges. On September 19th, near Hill 100, a platoon of Shermans was called forward to eliminate a cluster of caves that had resisted 2 days of infantry assaults. Marines had tried grenades and demolitions, but each time the Japanese returned, using secondary exits to outflank the attackers. When the Flame Shermans arrived, the battle changed in minutes. Eyewitnesses described jets of fire arcing into cave mouths, clinging to coral walls, and sending smoke billowing from unseen vents. The whole ridge seemed to breathe fire, one Marine later recalled. When infantry advanced afterward, they found positions abandoned or filled with charred bodies. The psychological effect was as decisive as the physical destruction. Post-war interrogation of Japanese survivors revealed that the flame tanks shattered morale. "We were told the caves were safe," one officer admitted in 1946. "But when fire entered, there was no safety. The air itself killed us." American debriefing notes recorded similar testimony. Defenders suffocated in smoke-filled tunnels long before flames reached them, making flamethrower tanks far deadlier than conventional weapons. Yet Peleliu also exposed the limitations of the weapon. The coral ridges were so jagged and steep that tanks often struggled to maneuver. Tracks slipped on sharp rock, and vehicles became easy targets for Japanese 47mm guns hidden in camouflaged bunkers. Several Shermans were knocked out in narrow passes, their wrecks blocking further advance. On one occasion, a flame tank attempting to fire into a cave was hit by artillery before igniting its projector. The resulting explosion was so violent that Marines mistook it for a naval shell strike. Still, the tank's contribution was undeniable. After-action reports estimated that Flame Shermans destroyed or neutralized over 70 cave positions during the campaign. Officers concluded that without them, Peleliu's already horrific casualty toll, over 10,000 Americans killed or wounded, would have been far worse. General William Rupertus, commanding the 1st Marine Division, admitted in his final report, the flamethrower tank was indispensable against this type of defense. For the Japanese, Peleliu confirmed their worst fears. Diaries recovered from the caves revealed a tone of despair. One soldier wrote days before his death, "We do not fear death, but we fear the fire. The cave that is our shield becomes our tomb." By November, when the last pockets of resistance were silenced, the Marines had learned bitter lessons. Peleliu was a harbinger of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, battles where caves would dominate the terrain and flamethrower tanks would no longer be rare experiments, but central instruments of war. On February 19, 1945, when the first waves of Marines stormed the black sands of Iwo Jima, they faced a battlefield designed for annihilation. General Tadamachi Kuribayashi had turned the volcanic island into a fortress of unprecedented complexity. Nearly 11 miles of tunnels honeycombed the ground, connecting bunkers, pillboxes, and artillery chambers carved into solid rock. Unlike earlier Japanese commanders, Kuribayashi forbade banzai charges. His strategy was simple: bleed the Americans white from underground. From the moment the landings began, the extent of this system became clear. Marines advancing past the beaches found that nearly every rise concealed a firing aperture. Machine guns swept the sands with enfilading fire. Mortars fell from unseen angles, and artillery fired from openings that vanished under camouflage nets. Naval and aerial bombardment, which had flattened Saipan and Tarawa, barely scarred Iwo Jima's defenses. The Japanese had burrowed too deep. Into this inferno rolled the Marine Corps' flame tanks. Unlike the experimental vehicles at Saipan and Peleliu, Iwo Jima fielded the most developed flame Shermans yet. Designated POA CWS H-1, Pacific Ocean Area Chemical Warfare Service Type H-1, these tanks mounted powerful flame projectors capable of hurling napalm 150 yards with enough fuel for multiple bursts. Each Marine division landing on Iwo Jima carried them as part of its assault force, a reflection of how essential the weapon had become. From the first days, their value was undeniable. On February 21st, near the base of Mount Suribachi, Marines of the 28th Regiment were pinned by a labyrinth of pillboxes that resisted bombing and shelling. A pair of flame Shermans was called forward. As they advanced, machine gun bullets spattered harmlessly off their armor. The tanks wheeled into position, their projectors belching gouts of flame that poured into the concrete embrasures. Observers watched as defenders, some still firing, were engulfed in a blast of orange fire and thick smoke. Infantry rushed in behind them, finding positions abandoned or filled with the burned dead. By day's end, the Shermans had cleared nearly 24 bunkers, allowing Marines to close in on Suribachi's slopes. The combination of tanks and infantry became a rhythm repeated across the island. Marines would identify a cave or strongpoint, pin down defenders, and call in a flame tank. The tank's fire would sweep the entrance, sucking oxygen from tunnels and forcing survivors out into waiting rifle fire. Napalm clung to rock, burning at over 1,500 degrees, transforming the defensive advantage of caves into a death trap. They thought the ground would save them, one Marine corporal later recalled. But when the tanks came, the ground burned. Japanese records confirmed the psychological devastation. In diaries recovered after the battle, soldiers described their terror. One entry reads, "The fire comes into the cave like a dragon. We cannot breathe, we cannot fight, we only die." Post-war interrogations reinforced this. Officers admitted that flamethrower tanks were the one weapon against which there was no countermeasure. Mines and artillery could destroy individual vehicles, but they could not prevent the methodical advance of flame across the island. The toll on the tanks themselves was high. Maneuvering across soft volcanic ash and jagged rock, they often became bogged down or immobilized. Japanese anti-tank guns, well concealed in Suribachi and the northern ridges, claimed several Shermans. When a flame tank was hit, the result was catastrophic. Fuel tanks exploding in towering fireballs that consumed the crew. Tankers knew the risks, but pressed on, often returning to battle after overnight repairs conducted under fire. By the time Iwo Jima was declared secured on March 26th, flamethrower tanks had played a central role. Marine after-action reports credited them with destroying hundreds of caves and pillboxes that would have otherwise cost thousands more lives to clear. The price of victory was immense, nearly 26,000 American casualties, but without flamethrower tanks, veterans believed the number would have doubled. For the Japanese, Iwo Jima proved that even their most elaborate underground fortress could be undone. Kuribayashi's men had inflicted terrible losses, yet they left behind testimony etched in diaries and ashes. Caves, once the shield of the Imperial Army, had become tombs in the face of armored fire. By April 1945, the battle for Okinawa had begun, the largest and bloodiest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. More than 180,000 American troops went ashore against nearly 100,000 Japanese defenders. Unlike Iwo Jima, where the fight was compressed into 8 square miles, Okinawa sprawled across 466 square miles of ridges, valleys, and limestone escarpments. Within that landscape, the Japanese had perfected their underground defense. General Mitsuru Ajishima, commanding the 32nd Army, established his main line of resistance along the Shuri Line, a network of interlocking caves, bunkers, and tunnels that cut across the island's southern third. Engineers blasted positions into limestone cliffs, dug artillery chambers shielded from bombardment, and camouflaged firing ports so skillfully that they remained invisible until they opened fire. For American troops advancing from the north, the Shuri Line became a wall of death. The task of breaching it fell heavily on the flamethrower tanks. By this stage of the war, the Marine Corps and Army had integrated the POA CWS H-1 Sherman flame tanks into every assault regiment. Their role was codified in doctrine. Infantry located cave positions, tanks delivered fire, and demolition sealed what survived. After-action reports from Okinawa would later emphasize this triad, rifle, fire, and explosive, as the only reliable method of clearing the Shuri defenses. On April 19, the U.S. Army's 24th Corps launched a major assault against Kakazu Ridge, one of the strongest Japanese positions. Artillery pounded the ridge for hours, and infantry advanced behind the barrage. But when the smoke cleared, defenders emerged unscathed from their caves and cut down the attackers with machine guns and mortars. Casualties mounted and progress stalled. Only when flame tanks were brought forward did the balance shift. Shermans rolled to within 50 yards of the caves, their nozzles spitting fire that cascaded into the openings. Witnesses recalled orange jets licking across the ridge, followed by thick, choking smoke rising from hidden vents. One platoon leader wrote in his journal, "Caves sealed, resistance ended. Without flame, impossible." The Japanese response was desperate. Anti-tank teams armed with satchel charges and magnetic mines attempted to rush the Shermans, often sacrificing themselves in the attempt. Others concentrated 47mm guns on the flame tanks, knowing a single hit could ignite the fuel. Losses were heavy. Several tanks exploded in spectacular blasts, but replacements rolled forward and the pressure never relented. The psychological toll on Japanese defenders was immense. Diaries recovered after the battle spoke of terror. One soldier wrote, "The fire comes into the cave and the air disappears. We claw at the walls but cannot escape." Post-war interrogations echoed this. Survivors admitted that flamethrower tanks broke their will more than artillery or bombing, because caves, once seen as sanctuaries, became traps. For American infantry, the tanks were saviors. A Marine sergeant from the 6th Division recalled fighting along Sugarloaf Hill. He recalled, "We lost dozens trying to storm those caves. Then the flame tanks came up, and suddenly it was possible. You could see the fire suck the life out of the ridge." Infantry who once dreaded closing with cave mouths now advanced with tanks beside them, using fire as both shield and spear. Still, progress across Okinawa was agonizingly slow. The Shuri line held for weeks, each hill and ridge requiring coordinated attacks with flame tanks at the center. The tanks themselves needed constant maintenance. Fuel lines clogged, igniters failed, and Japanese gunners targeted them relentlessly. Mechanics worked day and night in muddy fields, patching Shermans under fire to ensure they returned to the line the next morning. By June, the Shuri line finally collapsed under the weight of American firepower. Flame tanks had been at the forefront, destroying thousands of cave positions and breaking the back of organized resistance. Yet the cost was staggering. More than 12,000 Americans dead, 36,000 wounded, and an estimated 100,000 Japanese killed. In the aftermath, commanders acknowledged the central role of flamethrower tanks. An Army after-action report concluded, in cave warfare, no other weapon proved so effective or so feared. Their presence shortened the battle. Their absence would have prolonged it intolerably. For the Japanese soldiers who fought and died in the tunnels of Okinawa, the memory of those tanks lingered. They had expected to endure shells, bombs, and bullets. They had not expected the ground itself to burn. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, the men who had survived the caves of Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa carried with them memories they rarely shared in public, but often recorded in diaries, interrogations, and later memoirs. Among these memories, none carried the same terror as the sight or even the rumor of American flamethrower tanks. The Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, which compiled thousands of post-surrender interrogations, noted a recurring theme. Japanese officers and enlisted alike described flamethrower tanks as inescapable death machines. A sergeant from the 24th Division, captured on Okinawa, told interrogators, "We could resist bombs, we could endure artillery, but when the fire came into the caves, men lost their minds. They clawed each other, tried to dig with bare hands. There was no defense." Other testimonies revealed how the psychological impact extended far beyond the battlefield. Survivors recalled how entire units abandoned positions at the mere sight of the long, thin nozzles protruding from Sherman turrets. The flamethrower became a symbol of futility, eroding the Japanese doctrine of holding ground at all costs. One officer admitted in a 1946 interview, the flamethrower tank destroyed the spirit of resistance more effectively than any other weapon. Men no longer believed the cave was a shield, it became a tomb. Memoirs published in post-war Japan cautiously reflected this trauma. In Okinawa no Tatakai, the Battle of Okinawa, a junior officer remembered his comrades drawing lots to decide who would attempt suicide outside the cave, believing it more honorable than dying in fire underground. Another veteran wrote simply, "When the flame entered, even courage melted." These words stood in stark contrast to wartime propaganda that had promised invincibility in underground fortresses. The fear was not just personal but tactical. The Japanese 32nd Army's post-surrender reports acknowledged that flamethrower tanks systematically nullified their defensive network. The Shuri line, designed to withstand months of bombardment, had collapsed in weeks once tanks applied flame methodically to every cave and bunker. American records corroborate this. After-action reports consistently cite flamethrower tanks as the decisive factor in reducing positions once thought impregnable. Veterans' reunions in Japan during the 1960s and 1970s offered glimpses into the lasting impression. At a 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation and Ground Warfare Symposium, former officers candidly admitted that no countermeasure was ever devised. Anti-tank tactics, magnetic mines, suicide charges were occasionally successful, but losses were ruinous. As one colonel confessed, every man who carried a satchel charge knew he would not return, and even if one tank burned, more would come. For many, the horror of flame eclipsed the memory of bombs and bullets. Survivors described nightmares of suffocation, the sensation of heat in dark tunnels, and the screams of men burning where they sat. These accounts reached Japanese civilians only gradually. In the immediate post-war years, such testimony was muted, overshadowed by the atomic bombings and the broader devastation of defeat. Yet within the veteran community, the memory of flamethrower tanks became a dark shorthand for the futility of their struggle. American interrogators noted another striking element: grudging respect. Despite their fear, many Japanese acknowledged the weapon's effectiveness with almost clinical detachment. An officer at Sugamo Prison in 1946 remarked, "It was logical. You had the resources to build tanks, to mount flame, to bring them in number. We could not match that. It was the proof of industrial war." His words captured a recurring theme: recognition that the flamethrower tank was not only a battlefield weapon, but also a symbol of America's overwhelming production and adaptation. These testimonies also influenced Japanese post-war military doctrine. The newly formed self-defense forces studied flamethrower tanks in Allied reports, recognizing their role in nullifying fortified defenses. Japanese strategists concluded that static cave systems, once the pride of their engineers, had no future against mechanized flame. The lessons were bitter but enduring. For the men who had endured it, however, the memory was less about doctrine and more about survival, or the absence of it. A survivor from the caves of Motobu Peninsula told an interviewer in 1985, "When I smell kerosene even now, my chest tightens. I see the fire entering the cave. We believed we would fight forever underground. Instead, we burned like insects." By then, 40 years had passed since the Pacific War, but the flame had not dimmed in memory. It had become part of Japan's private history of defeat, a reminder that technology and industry could overwhelm even the deepest bunkers and the strongest wills. For Japanese veterans, the flamethrower tank remained the ultimate symbol of a war they could not win.
When the last campaigns of the Pacific ended in 1945, the flamethrower tank's role shifted from battlefield terror to historical lesson. For the U.S. military, the weapon was both a triumph of ingenuity and a reminder of the brutality demanded by the Island War. For Japan, it became a symbol of defeat, a reminder that no fortress, however carefully engineered, could withstand the combination of American industry and tactical adaptation. In the immediate post-war years, the U.S. Army and Marine Corps conducted extensive evaluations of armored flamethrowers. Reports compiled by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey's Ground Division noted that mechanized flame units consistently reduced resistance in fortified areas faster and with fewer friendly casualties than conventional infantry and artillery methods. 13th Corps' after-action reports from Okinawa emphasized that entire sectors collapsed once flame tanks were brought forward. The statistics were compelling. On Iwo Jima alone, Marine units credited flamethrower tanks with neutralizing more than half of the island's 1,500 reinforced cave positions. Yet there was unease, even among the victors. Veterans who had manned the M4A3R3 Saipan tanks described their missions with pride, but also with unease. A tank commander recalled in a 1947 oral history, "We knew it saved American lives, but seeing men leap from caves burning is not something you forget. It wasn't war in the old sense, it was extermination." Such testimony reflected a tension that persisted long after the war, the undeniable effectiveness of mechanized flame against the moral weight of its use. This moral debate deepened in the post-war world. By the 1950s, international conventions began scrutinizing the use of incendiary weapons. While flamethrowers were never explicitly banned under the Geneva Conventions, their use against personnel was increasingly regarded as inhumane. The Korean War saw limited deployment of flamethrower tanks, particularly against bunkers along the Pusan perimeter, but the scale never matched the Pacific campaigns. By the Vietnam era, portable flamethrowers remained in use, but armored flame vehicles were rare. The psychological scars of World War II had already framed the weapon as too cruel for modern battle. For Japan, the legacy of flamethrower tanks was woven into post-war memory in quieter ways. During the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Symposium on Pacific Operations, Japanese officers candidly admitted that mechanized flame had destroyed their last illusions about underground warfare. Engineers who had designed Okinawa's tunnel networks later conceded that their work had been rendered obsolete before the battle began. One of them remarked, "We thought in stone and earth. America thought in steel and fire." The Japanese self-defense forces, established in the 1950s, studied Allied records closely. Their doctrinal manuals of the 1960s explicitly warned against reliance on fixed fortifications, citing the Pacific War as proof that firepower applied by mechanized flame renders underground defense untenable. The cave systems that had once been central to Japanese defense strategy were never revived. In the United States, the legacy of flamethrower tanks endured in a different way. Museums such as the National World War II Museum in New Orleans and the U.S. Army Armor and Cavalry Collection preserved surviving examples, often displayed with sobering explanations of their battlefield role. At veteran reunions in the 1970s and 1980s, former tankers spoke of their vehicles with a mixture of pride and melancholy. The weapon had saved lives. Thousands of Marines and soldiers owed their survival to its existence, but it had also inflicted suffering on a scale difficult to reconcile with modern values. Perhaps the most enduring legacy, however, lay in the testimonies of those who had faced the flame. Japanese veterans, interviewed in the decades after the war, spoke less of bombs and bullets than of the fire that invaded their sanctuaries. Their words carried a lesson that transcended tactics. War, when driven to extremes, devours not only armies, but also humanity itself. By the time of the 1985 Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, both sides acknowledged this truth openly. American tankers and Japanese infantrymen, once locked in deadly combat, spoke with a shared understanding of what flame had meant. One American veteran summed it up. "We had no choice. They wouldn't surrender, and we couldn't leave them behind. Flame was the answer. But no one who used it ever felt clean afterward." Thus, the story of the flamethrower tank closed not with victory parades or technical accolades, but with reflection. Its place in history was secure as a weapon that ended battles and saved American lives. Yet its legacy also carried the heavy imprint of horror, for both those who used it and for those who endured it. In the Pacific, the caves remain. On Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, visitors still walk past scorched stone and collapsed tunnels, mute reminders of fire unleashed in the name of war. The lessons of mechanized flame endure there too, that in the clash of industry and will, it was not stone or courage that proved decisive, but fire.